John Garrett was a 72-year-old man who lived alone in a small cabin deep in the Montana wilderness. After losing his wife, he found comfort in nature, spending his days surrounded by towering pine trees, the sound of birds, and the gentle flow of a nearby creek. His life was quiet, predictable, and peaceful. One chilly autumn morning, as John sat on his porch sipping coffee, he heard a strange sound coming from the forest. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then he heard it again, a desperate, painful cry. His heart pounded. It was the sound of an animal in distress. Grabbing his old flashlight and field kit, he followed the sound into the woods. The air was crisp, and a light mist covered the ground as he walked carefully through the dense trees. The cries grew louder, leading him toward the creek. As he got closer, he spotted something lying near the water, a dog, trapped in an old, rusted metal trap. The sight broke John's heart. The dog's leg was caught, and it was struggling weakly. Its fur was dirty, and its ribs were slightly visible, suggesting it had been on its own for a while. But what struck John the most were its eyes, wide, full of fear, yet pleading for help. John knew the dog was in pain, and a trapped animal could be dangerous. But he also knew he couldn't just walk away. Taking a deep breath, he slowly approached, speaking softly. "Easy there, boy," he whispered. "I'm here to help." The dog stopped struggling and looked at him. In that moment, John realized this was no ordinary rescue, this was a moment that would change everything. John knew he had to be careful. A trapped animal was unpredictable, especially one in pain. If the dog felt threatened, it might try to bite or struggle harder, making its injury worse. But John couldn't ignore the suffering in its eyes. He took slow, steady steps toward the dog, keeping his voice calm and gentle. "It's okay, boy. I won't hurt you," he whispered, kneeling a few feet away. The dog let out a weak whimper but didn't growl or try to move. John placed his field kit on the ground and carefully opened it. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up a small tool to loosen the rusted metal trap. The device was old and cruel, likely left behind by a hunter long ago. It had snapped tightly around the dog's leg, cutting into its fur. Blood had dried around the wound, and John could see the dog's leg was swollen. "This is going to hurt a little," he murmured, reaching toward the trap. As soon as he touched the metal, the dog flinched, letting out a sharp yelp. John pulled back for a moment, giving the dog time to calm down. "I know it hurts, but I have to get this off," he reassured it. He tried again, working quickly but carefully. The metal was stiff from years of rust, and it took all his strength to pry it open. Sweat formed on his forehead as he struggled with the mechanism. After what felt like forever, the trap finally loosened with a loud creak. The dog yanked its leg free and stumbled backward. For a moment, John feared it would run away. But instead, it stayed still, panting heavily. The dog lifted its injured leg slightly, testing it, then looked at John. John backed away, giving the dog space. "You're free now," he said softly. To his surprise, instead of running, the dog limped toward him. It lowered its head and gently nudged his hand with its nose. The simple gesture made John's chest tighten with emotion. He had expected the dog to be afraid, maybe even aggressive. But in that moment, he realized something remarkable: this dog understood. "You're welcome," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The dog stared at him a little longer, then, with one last look, turned and slowly disappeared into the forest. John stood there, watching, knowing this moment had changed both their lives forever. John stood in the quiet forest, watching as the injured dog limped away. He expected it to run as far as possible, but before disappearing into the trees, the dog stopped and looked back. For a brief moment, their eyes met again. It was as if the dog was saying thank you. Then, with a slow turn, it vanished into the wilderness. John let out a deep breath, feeling both relief and wonder. He had helped many animals in his years living in the wilderness, but this felt different. There was something in the way the dog had looked at him, something that felt almost human, a silent understanding, a connection beyond words. As John walked back to his cabin, his mind replayed the moment over and over. He had freed a wild animal, one that could have attacked him or fled in fear. But instead, the dog had chosen to trust him, even for just a moment. That night, as he sat by the fireplace sipping a cup of tea, he stared out the window into the dark forest. He wondered if the dog had found shelter. Was it safe? Was it in too much pain to hunt for food? Would it even survive? The questions filled his mind, but there were no answers. Days passed. Every morning, John found himself looking toward the forest, hoping for a sign of the dog. He checked the area where he had freed it, searching for tracks, but the forest floor had been disturbed by wind and rain. There was no trace of the animal. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, he thought about the way the dog had nudged his hand. Why had it done that? Most wild animals, when injured and freed, would simply run. But this dog had stayed, even for a few seconds, as if to say something. John sighed, shaking his head. He had lived alone for so long, used to the quiet, the routine. But now, there was something new in his heart, a feeling he couldn't quite name. He didn't know if he would ever see the dog again. But deep down, he hoped he would. 3 days had passed since John freed the injured dog from the trap. Every morning, as he sipped his coffee on the porch, he found himself looking toward the forest, wondering if the dog was safe. He knew it was foolish to expect an animal to return, but deep inside, he hoped to see it again. On the third morning, as the sun cast golden light over the trees, John noticed movement at the edge of the forest. His heart skipped a beat. There it was, the same dog. The dog walked slowly, its injured leg still slightly raised. But this time, something was different. It wasn't alone. 2 small puppies trailed behind it, their tiny bodies covered in dirt, their ears floppy, and their legs wobbly as they struggled to keep up. John leaned forward, barely believing his eyes. The dog was a mother. John remained still, not wanting to scare them. The mother dog stopped a few feet away, watching him carefully. Her eyes were no longer full of fear. Instead, they held something else, trust. Then, to John's amazement, the dog gently dropped something from her mouth onto the ground. A freshly caught rabbit. John stared at the offering, speechless. The mother dog took a few steps back, nudging her puppies closer to her as if waiting for his response. For a moment, John didn't know what to do. No wild animal had ever brought him a gift before. He had spent years in the wilderness, observing nature, but this was different. This was a deliberate act, a thank you. John swallowed the lump in his throat and slowly stood up. "You didn't have to do that, girl," he said softly. "But I appreciate it." He bent down, picked up the rabbit, and gave the dog a small nod. The mother dog let out a soft huff, almost as if she understood. John then turned his attention to the puppies. They huddled close to their mother, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. They were thin, their ribs slightly visible. They had been struggling to survive. John sighed and stepped back toward his porch. He opened his cabin door and went inside, grabbing a plate of leftover food. He returned and carefully placed it on the ground, then stepped back to give them space. The mother dog sniffed the food and, after a moment, lowered her head to eat. The puppies quickly followed, their tiny mouths eagerly taking small bites. John sat back down on his porch, watching them in silence. A warmth spread in his chest. The dog had trusted him enough to return. Not just alone, but with her family. For the first time in years, John didn't feel so alone. He took a sip of his coffee, a small smile forming on his lips. Maybe this was just the beginning of something special. Winter had arrived in full force. The cold winds howled through the Montana mountains, and the sky was heavy with dark clouds. John had lived through many harsh winters, but this one felt different. The weather reports warned of a massive blizzard, one that could last for days. He spent the day preparing, stacking firewood near the cabin, making sure he had enough food, and sealing the windows to keep the cold out. As night fell, the first snowflakes began to fall, light at first, but soon turning into a thick, swirling storm. John sat by the fire, sipping hot tea, listening to the wind howling outside. His cabin was warm and safe, but he couldn't help but think about the mother dog and her puppies. Had they found shelter? Were they safe? He had seen them a few days ago near the tree line, but now, with the storm getting worse, he worried. Hours passed, and the storm grew fiercer. Snow piled up against the windows, and the wind rattled the cabin walls. Just as John was about to head to bed, he heard it, a desperate scratching at his door. His heart pounded. He grabbed his flashlight and hurried to the door. When he opened it, a strong gust of wind blew snow into the cabin, but John barely noticed. The mother dog stood there, covered in snow, her fur wet and frozen. She let out a sharp bark, her eyes wide with panic. She wasn't just seeking shelter, she wanted him to follow. John hesitated for only a second. If she was out in this storm, risking her life to come to him, something was very wrong. "All right, girl," he said, grabbing his coat and boots. "I'm coming." He quickly gathered his emergency pack, filled with blankets, a first aid kit, and some food. Then, pulling on his gloves, he stepped outside into the freezing night. The cold hit him like a punch. The snow was deep, reaching up to his knees, and the wind made it hard to see. But the dog didn't wait, she turned and started moving, looking back to make sure he was following. John pushed forward, trusting her completely. He had no idea where she was leading him, but if this dog had come all this way for him, it meant someone, or something, needed help. They moved through the storm, step by step, the snow crunching beneath their feet. John's hands were numb, and his breath came in short gasps, but he didn't stop. He had followed this dog once before and saved her life. Now, she was leading him to something that might change his life again. John pushed through the freezing wind, following the mother dog as she led him deeper into the snow-covered forest. The storm was brutal, with icy gusts stinging his face and snow piling high around his legs. But he didn't stop. The dog had come to him for a reason. She moved quickly, looking back every few steps to make sure John was following. Her urgency sent a chill through him, and it wasn't just from the cold. Something was wrong, very wrong. After what felt like forever, the dog suddenly stopped at the edge of a ravine. John shined his flashlight ahead, trying to see through the swirling snow. That's when he noticed a narrow crevice below, barely visible through the thick frost. Then, he saw it, a small hand sticking out of the snow. John's breath caught in his throat. He scrambled down the slope as fast as he could, his heart pounding. As he got closer, the flashlight beam revealed two children, half buried in the snow, barely conscious. A boy and a girl, no older than 8 or 9, curled up tightly together for warmth. Their clothes were frozen stiff, their lips pale and trembling. They were alive, but only just. And beside them, huddled close, were the dog's 2 puppies. The tiny animals had pressed themselves against the children, using their own body heat to keep them warm. John's hands shook as he dropped to his knees. He quickly pulled off his backpack and wrapped both children in thick blankets, rubbing their arms and faces to get their blood flowing. "Hey, kids," he said gently, his voice barely steady. "Can you hear me?" The little girl's eyes fluttered open. She blinked slowly, confused, her gaze shifting between John and the mother dog. "The dog, she found us," she whispered weakly. John felt his throat tighten. This incredible animal hadn't just saved her own puppies, she had saved these children's lives. The boy stirred next, letting out a weak moan. He was cold, too cold, but he was breathing. That was all that mattered. "You're safe now," John assured them. "We're getting you out of here." He pulled the boy onto his back, then scooped the little girl into his arms. The puppies, sensing John's urgency, followed closely behind. Looking at the mother dog, he nodded. "Let's go, girl." The dog turned, leading the way back through the storm, her tail flicking as if she knew they had just done something incredible. As John carried the children towards safety, he realized one thing: this mother dog wasn't just brave. She was a hero. John struggled through the deep snow, carrying the two half-frozen children in his arms. The storm was still raging, and the wind howled around him, but he kept moving. He had to get them back to the cabin. The mother dog walked beside him, her puppies following closely. She kept looking up at John as if making sure he was still carrying the children safely. He could barely feel his hands, and his legs were tired, but he pushed forward. The children were weak and cold, their small bodies shivering against his chest. After what felt like an eternity, John finally saw the warm glow of his cabin through the snow. His heart pounded with relief. They had made it. He kicked open the door and hurried inside, closing it quickly behind him to keep out the freezing wind. The warmth of the fire hit him immediately, but he had no time to rest. The children needed help. John gently laid them on a thick rug near the fireplace. He grabbed his warmest blankets and wrapped them up tightly. Their faces were pale, and their lips were still blue from the cold. He rubbed their hands and arms, trying to bring warmth back into their tiny bodies. The mother dog moved closer, sniffing the children before softly licking their faces. She wasn't just watching them, she was comforting them. John rushed to heat some broth on the stove. When it was ready, he carefully spoon-fed the warm liquid to the children. The little girl whimpered and slowly opened her eyes. She looked around in confusion before whispering, "Where's the dog?" John smiled and pointed. The mother dog was right there, curled up beside her puppies, never leaving the children's side. "You're safe now," John said softly. "She brought you to me." Hours passed, and the storm outside finally began to calm. The wind softened, and the heavy snowfall turned into a gentle flurry. But John knew the children's parents must be desperate, searching for them in the blizzard. Then, just as the morning light broke through the trees, John heard a faint sound in the distance, the low hum of a helicopter. He rushed outside, waving his arms. Soon, a rescue team arrived, led by two frantic parents. The moment they stepped into the cabin and saw their children wrapped in blankets, their eyes filled with tears. The mother ran forward, dropping to her knees and holding them tightly. "Oh, my babies," she sobbed. The father turned to John, his voice shaking. "How did you find them?" John glanced at the mother dog, who was now watching quietly from the corner. "I didn't," he said. "She did." The rescue team, the parents, and even the rangers stood in stunned silence. The dog had done something no human could. And in that moment, John knew this was no ordinary animal. She was a guardian, a hero, a true friend. The story of the heroic dog spread through the town like wildfire. Everyone was amazed by how a simple stray had saved two innocent children in the middle of a deadly storm. The local newspaper ran the headline, "Brave Dog Saves Lost Children, a True Miracle in the Blizzard." Soon, people from all over started talking about the incredible rescue. Some called it luck, but most believed it was something more, an act of true bravery and loyalty. The parents of the rescued children couldn't stop thanking John. They told everyone how he and the mother dog had worked together to bring their kids back home safely. Many in town had never thought much about stray animals before, but after hearing the story, their hearts changed. People began to appreciate the wildlife around them. The same people who once saw stray dogs as a nuisance now looked at them with kindness. Children who used to be afraid of wild animals started asking questions. Can animals really feel love? Do they understand kindness like we do? The story made everyone think in a new way. As the days passed, more changes started happening. The mayor called a special meeting to discuss wildlife conservation. Inspired by the story, new rules were put in place to protect animals from illegal trapping. Rangers were sent to remove all the old, rusted traps from the forests. Anyone caught harming an animal unfairly would now face a heavy fine. At the local school, something even more special happened. A group of students, led by the two rescued children, started a wildlife rescue club. Their goal was simple: to help and protect animals, just like the mother dog had done for them. The school arranged a special event to honor the brave dog. People gathered in the auditorium, and John was invited to speak. He stood on the stage, looking at the crowd of eager faces. He wasn't used to public speaking, but today, he had something important to say. This dog didn't have a home, he began. She didn't have a family to protect her. And yet, when it mattered most, she didn't think twice before saving 2 human lives. He paused and looked at the children in the audience. If an animal can show this much kindness, then we can do the same. We must protect them, just as they protect us. The room filled with applause. That day, many people signed up to join the Wildlife Rescue Club. The children promised to take care of animals in need, and the town agreed to make sure no stray was left to suffer. John had always believed that kindness created ripples. What had started with one act of compassion, freeing a trapped dog, had now grown into something much bigger. And as he sat on his porch that evening, watching the mother dog and her puppies playing near his cabin, he smiled. Their story had changed not just his life, but the lives of an entire community. The mother dog and her puppies became a part of John's life. Every few days, they would come to his cabin, wagging their tails, happy to see him. John always kept food and fresh water for them, and in return, they gave him company. For the first time in years, John didn't feel alone. The town had changed since the rescue. People treated animals with kindness, and the Wildlife Rescue Club at the school was growing. Children often came to visit John, eager to hear the story of the brave dog who saved 2 lives. John never got tired of telling it. Seasons passed, and soon spring arrived. The snow melted, the trees turned green, and the mountain air was filled with the songs of birds. One warm morning, as John sipped his coffee on the porch, he heard the familiar sound of paws on the ground. The mother dog had returned, but this time, she was alone. John's heart sank. The puppies were gone. He knew this day would come. They had grown up and moved on to live their own lives in the wild. That was nature's way. But it still made him sad. The mother dog walked up to him slowly, her golden brown eyes looking deep into his. She sat down right in front of him, her tail still, her expression calm. John placed his coffee down and leaned forward. "Hey, girl," he said softly. "You came to say goodbye, didn't you?" The dog didn't bark, didn't whimper. Instead, she did something John would never forget. She pressed her forehead gently against his knee, staying there for a long moment. It was her way of saying thank you. John felt his eyes well up with tears. He reached out and softly ran his fingers through her fur. "You take care of yourself out there," he whispered. After a few moments, the dog stepped back. She looked at him one last time, then turned and walked toward the forest. John watched as her figure disappeared into the trees, just as she had that first day when he freed her from the trap. But this time, he knew she wouldn't be coming back. John sat there in silence for a long time. His heart was heavy, but he also felt something else, gratitude. Their friendship had been a gift. Over the years, John continued to share the story of the mother dog. He spoke at schools, at community events, and to anyone who would listen. He wanted people to understand that kindness to animals could change the world. And every time he told the story, he would end with the same words: one act of kindness can change a life forever. And sometimes, it can change even more than that.